And we're live. Welcome everybody to our little live chat. Got with me 86 Boxing. Joshua City from 86 Boxing. What's up, brother?
Hello, hello, hello. Appreciate it. What's up, Brandon? I'm glad to be here, man.
Great to have you. This is going to be a short chat, everybody. Hopefully we can do a follow-up on this. I just participated last night in an epic top 10 middleweights of all time countdown with Boxing Librarian and Scrapbook Boxing. And we had actually planned this discussion for the lead up to the thing, but it didn't work out that way, our schedules being what they are. So this is not quite a recap, but just I've been doing a lot of hand wringing, trying to weigh different resumes against each other in the context of their various eras. And so I want to talk to Josh here about it. We're going to have a little discussion. I've got up here on the screen, this is actually a year from early in Sam Langford's career. This is 1904. So he only had the one fight at pro in 02. 1903, he was a lightweight. 1904, he was a welterweight contender. And this was the schedule he fought. But this is just one example. I'm going to just briefly touch on this, and then we'll relate it to other kinds of schedules, like other sorts of... Because Josh, as you know, the win-loss record doesn't really tell any part of the story because it's all about who somebody's in there with. And different careers, the tough matchups are sprinkled in differently. Sometimes it's all at the end, sometimes in the middle, sometimes it's all throughout. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I agree with that 100%. We kind of get lost in that narrative here these days. Of course, the guys are fighting a lot less often, but still, yeah, it all comes down to the matchup because theoretically anyone can build up a record and make it look as though it's something more than what it is. And we see that often when a lot of these undefeated guys get their wake-up call when they step it up a bit in the level of competition.
Right. So it all depends. So like at this point, this is Langford's third year of boxing. I don't know if he actually trained at all in 1901 or if 1902 was the only time he was living in the gym and sparring. He went through that progression from basically cleaning the gym to a sparring partner to a fighter in that year. So I don't know how many years he'd actually been throwing hands in gloves, but this was only his third season and his second full season. But he was coming off a 15-round decision win over the great Joe Gans, probably the greatest lightweight of all time, but certainly one of the most brilliant fighters of that early era, someone who a lot of people learned things from. He had beaten him over 15 rounds, and then his last fight of the year, he had drawn with the great Jack Blackburn, a brilliant defensive fighter. And Blackburn had got the best of him, but it was a prearranged draw, meaning I think his manager insisted on it, Langford's manager, which, basically if it goes the distance, you draw and you split the money even, and it doesn't go on your record as a loss or a win. So Blackburn got the best of it. So heading into 1904, but what's interesting about 1904 is so Blackburn was okay fighting at welterweight that year instead of lightweight. Joe Gans himself, the great lightweight, fought Barbados Walcott, the welterweight champ, at welter that year. Sam Langford moved up to welter, and so did Dave Hawley. And so Dave Hawley, he met him, and he actually lost his first fight to Dave Hawley. Styles make fights. They fought 3 times that year, but the first time they met, Hawley was able to use like the shoulder roll and some of the crouching techniques and then switching it up, going from, fighting on the back foot to then coming forward two-handed, and was able to get the win off over him. And this was, even though like Hawley and Langford had some common opponents, and Blackburn and Gans, they all had a lot of common opponents, and they had varying degrees of success at different times in the series that they might have had with each other. They fought 2 more times that year. And, but Langford, he saw Andy Watson, who was a clever lightweight, who fought a ton of prearranged draws. Then he fights Blackburn again. So he already fought him, I think, in December. So now he fights him again in mid-January. Then he fights Belfield Walcott for the second time, beats him. That's the brother of the reigning welterweight champion. So now he has 2 wins over the welterweight champion's brother. Then he fights, I can't remember the guy's first name. It was Charlie Johnson? What's the Johnson guy's name? Charles Johnson, yeah. Finished, random guy practically. Finished them in 5. Then he fights Willie Lewis, who was early in his career, but went on to do some good things, to be a top caliber guy. So he beats Willie Lewis. Then he fights the first one with Hawley, loses to Hawley. Then he smashes Elbows McFadden, who'd been a factor, but a few years prior was a little bit past it maybe. the careers didn't last as long. Then he fights the reigning undisputed welterweight champion, Barbados Walcott, 15 rounds to a draw. Then 2 more fights with Holly. Then another fight with Watson, Sullivan character, and then Tommy Sullivan. He might have even been a fill-in that night. And then Blackburn again, and then Joe Reed destroys Joe Reed to close out the year. That's 1 year, the 3rd season he's fighting. The texture of that career, like this is why like certain other guys, their early years, you can't compare them to certain other fighters. Certain fighters of the past, the way they were matched harder than some of the top fighters today are matched. Certainly. Because Dave Holly, Barbados Walcott was one of the greats of his generation. Langford had just beaten one of the other greats of the prior generation, Joe Gans, who was still on top. And, Holly and Walcott had been among the top, and they were still there, and they still had some years to go. But Holly is a top contender. Langford and Holly, that one of their fights was a title eliminator. Unfortunately, they were supposed to fight the winner of Walcott and Joe Gans in a champ-champ fight. Then that fight became non-title. Then they drew over 20 rounds. Then Walcott shot himself in the hand and was out for 2 years. So in the end, it didn't matter what Holly and Langford had done the day before. And then Langford just fought up the weights. But at this time, he only really spends 1 year at welterweight. But look at that welterweight resume. That's not a normal year at one weight. He's fighting former lightweights who became powerful welterweights as he did. And then also, like Watson was pretty much a lightweight. But then he fights Walcott, one of the greatest welterweights of all time. If I'm not mistaken, Nat Fleischer and Charlie Rose, he was their number 1 welterweight of all time.
Yeah, he certainly has an argument there for sure.
Oh, what's up, Andre? Welcome to the chat. Yeah, this is just a short one, Andre, because I got to go to work in about 20 minutes. So we're going to do about another 15. But that's okay. So that's just yes, sir. So that's to sketch out. So that's Langford when he's very young. He's fighting a ridiculous schedule, and that kept going. That's part of what sets him apart. It's not that he fought for a bunch of years. That's not unique. It's not that he fought a bunch of years with one eye. That's not even as unique as we would hope. But it's that he started off at a crazy schedule, and a lot of the other people in boxing history who started off at that match super tough couldn't keep it up. Even if they were good, like Larry Temple, one of Langford's opponents, and he was actually Tom O'Rourke's new protege after he had the breakup with the great Barbados Walcott. Larry Temple was supposed to be the guy who'd come and beat him and score one for the team. They had a rivalry, but Langford also fought him. He lost to him the first time, and then later on, I think, drew him one with him. But Langford got better and better. But at first time Langford met certain styles, he didn't always get the best. Sometimes it was a draw or a loss, and he'd have to learn from it. But today, when people...
That's the nature of the sport from a foundational standpoint. And that's one of the things that they generally try to teach you in the amateurs, because oftentimes you're not going to go through the amateur circuit, especially if you're fighting often and against the best fighters in national competitions and when world competitions. You're going to take some losses. It's how you bounce back from that, how you learn from that. And I think that's the nature of what it was for these guys back then, especially considering they oftentimes didn't have extensive amateur careers. So a lot of that buildup was taking place right there in the pros. And they didn't have the luxury of some of the things that we have today from a technological standpoint. So you weren't often, especially in those early days of your career, getting any form of scouting in on your opponent. You're just kind of going in there. You're learning right there when you're in the ring. So that has to be taken into account when you think about some of these early career fights, win or loss.
Certainly, not every fighter had backing. Like when Barbados Walcott started, he was Tom O'Rourke's protege. He was the lightweight at the time protege. So he'd already wrestled and boxed and fought people as an amateur, mixed rules, stuff like that. So he had that. Langford spent very little time or fights as an amateur. 3 fights is all I could find. So, and then he was off to the races. And by the end of his first full year, because he fought once as a pro, and then he went off to do some manual labor in New Hampshire. But then the winter apparently reminded him why he didn't like manual labor in the winter, and he came back, and that's when he started taking it seriously. And he was matched tough throughout his first year, and it capped off fighting 2 of the great stylists of that era, Joe Gans and Jack Blackburn. So his experience right off the bat, he was already very experienced. It was hard for people to surprise him. because he'd seen it all within several years. He'd seen so many looks and so many great versions of those looks, not just random guys doing it. Like Dave Hawley was really tricky, and Joe Gans was brilliant. He'd set multiple traps, like he'd layer his traps. Like Joe Gans was a special level of dangerous, especially to a relatively inexperienced fighter. So that was considered a really, really big upset, and that made Langford prominent internationally right at the end of his first season. Now, other fighters take a longer build, but they can also find tremendous success. So let me see if I can go find. So we'd done our middleweight countdown, and among those middleweights, there were so many different textures as I'm trying to weigh these. And Langford actually made my number 3 middleweight, although he didn't have as many middleweight fights as most of the other guys in contention for that ranking. But what Langford did was fighting light heavyweights and heavyweights, including great heavyweights, as a middleweight, which I count higher personally. I would say that's harder. Like I wouldn't want to see like Sugar Ray Robinson, Harry Greb, Monzon, Hagler. These are great fighters, right? Badass, pound for pound, excellent. But I wouldn't like their chances against Sam McVeigh.
Certainly.
The Oxnard Cyclone, 200 to 210 pounds. Later in his career, I think 220 or more. But, a absolute ripped, stocky 200 to 210 knockout puncher with both hands. Could fight on the retreat as well. Jabs and hooks, moving backwards just as well as smacking people around on the charging in. I don't like their chances. He would just run them over like he did larger fighters than them. You have to have the power, and Langford had that crazy power to keep people off. But so partly he was able to be matched as tough as he was because he had that big equalizer. He had a chin and a fist to compensate. But you see guys like Monzon where he lost 3 of his first 25 fights, something like that, and then never lost again, including being undefeated in title fights. Went out on top. So it's not that a slow build doesn't work. It's just that a lot of times with a slow build, there are a lot of questions way too late into a career. With Langford, a lot of those questions were answered before definitely before he'd left his teens. And so maybe it's harsher on the boxer when you get weeded out very quickly. But as far as the greatness that remains of the people who can do it at that schedule was pretty intense. I think today's guys would struggle to fight 12 fights and 4 of them really, really hard fights a year. They might find it difficult. They might have to have a different kind of life. A lot of these pugilists were literally full-time, like they never stopped. Maybe a few days off, but they weren't taking months off, most of them. But what I wanted to ask you, I've been babbling here, I'm using up all our time. So what I wanted to ask you is like, can you think of some guys today who were matched? I can think of Lomachenko, but you can think of other guys who were matched tough relatively early in their career and still managed to do well.
Yeah. I think there's certainly layers to it. I would say that right now at the current stage that we are here in this present time, you see that often with a lot of the guys who are good amateurs, especially those coming out of Eastern Europe and the Western Russian region, Russia region. I think that a lot of those guys are certainly match tough. Like for modern example of Mirajan Akhmadaliev, I think he's 7 fights in right now, and he's already a world champion at 122 pounds, I believe it is,
wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I believe it's 120 or 126. I'm trying to think. I could be off. It might be 130 actually, but one of the two. MJ. It's the same division that Stephen Fulton is fighting in, Brandon Figueroa. So that might be 130. But he's an example of one of the fighters who was out there who was matched tough early. I think about guys like Lomachenko, of course, as you mentioned. If you want to go back to the early 2000s, there are guys like that. Say, for instance, relative to how they were building them up then, what's his name? Fernando Vargas, for instance. He didn't have a ton of fights overall in his career, but relative to the amount of fights he had some pretty tough names on there. When he fought Winky Wright when he was young, early on, he was still fairly young when he was in there with Tito Trinidad, things of that nature. So that's a good example as well. But I'm sure there are more out there as well. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think it helps to build the character of a fighter, especially if they have the wherewithal and the will to continue on, even if they do take a loss. Just think about Bernard Hopkins with his lack of overall experience at the time that he fought Roy Jones Jr., but he didn't let that stop him from maturing to become one of the great fighters of all time. So I think there are examples out there, of course, of those who sort of relish from that. So that's something that people need to, or these young fighters need to keep in mind. Every fight should be a learning experience, whether that's win or loss. You don't benefit as much from easy touches that make you look good in some sense, sort of like Edgar Berlanga, who started out on a hot run with his 16 straight knockouts in the first round, and he's going through a tough, rough patch. He's getting wins, but it's a rough patch for him, and that's a prime example of matchmaking, making someone look very good early on, and as the road gets a bit tougher, you start to see that some of those wrinkles you thought he might have had, he really hasn't been able to really hone those in as of yet. But certainly, I commend those who do bounce back from those early losses and do learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, Jeanette started off, he had some draws, but he was 10-10, 10 wins, 10 losses to start his career. But he was matched tougher than almost anyone in history. You could actually argue he was matched the toughest of any eventually successful boxer. His early career was mental, but that allowed him to achieve the heights. And, you know, for me, his greatest height was April 1909 in Paris, where he won a 49-round finish fight against the great Sam McVeigh in quite possibly the greatest title fight of all time, you know, for the colored heavyweight title, I believe. And, you know, 49 3-minute rounds. These weren't like the knockdown rules, like the old school. These were 3-minute rounds. And, but part of why Jeanette was so remarkably rugged wasn't just his physical characteristics and his personal like attributes, but also he was matched so tough to start. You couldn't really show him something that that would seem grueling to him compared to what he'd already been through, combined with his excellent training, obviously, and his discipline. And he was a clever fighter. You know, he could get in and out with jabs as well as the other kinds of work, the close-in work. So he wasn't someone who had to take a ton of damage all the time. But he could fight. He could take it and he could dish it. But he was able to reach that height because he'd already faced tremendous adversity from the word go. I think Lomachenko, you know, is not very active. Jeanette had a ton of fights compared to Lomachenko.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of his years, he probably fought half as many as Lomachenko has had as a pro in a year. You know, he would get that out the way. But but it forges these fighters, guys like Joe Gans and George Dixon, the horrible conditions they came up in when they were first fighting people helped, you know, bring them to heights that maybe not be reachable today. Just and also, like, today we have much more understanding of what fighting does to us. So, you know, in the back of people's minds are like, yeah, I don't want to die young, thanks. You know, not that Jeanette did, but like a lot of fighters died young, or like Sam Langford died blind. So it's not necessarily that it's smarter to do it the way they did it back then, but as far as the quality of fighter it produces, I think you make a good argument. It lets people get to other heights. But like Lomachenko is a great example of someone who came in with a lot of fanfare and then didn't take really padded fights. These are tough. He still hasn't had that many pro fights, even though he spent years doing it. So his training to fight ratio is crazy, but he is doing good work. And actually, Usyk has done fantastic things for a guy with so few fights. He's had less career fights as a pro than Langford had in 1903 as a teenager. But he's done great things, you know, really great things. I'm looking forward to that rematch, too. That's going to be a good fight. I might favor Joshua a little bit on the second fight. I think he's used his size a little more.
Yeah, I did favor Joshua in the first fight. I thought his size would certainly be a factor. And Usyk, I thought he went about it well in terms of just his overall building up to the heavyweight, just thinking about it from his overall look. And you know, I think he put on the weight well and all of that. But yeah, I do think that Joshua's best chance is going to be him having a bit more aggression this time around. I don't know that I can necessarily pick him this time around. I'm gonna go with Usyk continuing to sort of hone himself from a skill perspective at heavyweight, and I think he will put in the work needed, or he will have put in the work needed to carry him over Joshua again. And I think he's probably going to come in with a bit more confidence than he even had in his last fight. He's felt some of the big punches or the best stuff that Joshua has had to offer. Not that Joshua landed a ton of things that really hurt Usyk, and Usyk did have a little bit of damage, but I think that Usyk, he probably feels a whole lot better at heavyweight now that he's gotten this off the book. This was a big pressure fight for him that first time around, and of course the pressure is here now. But I do think there's more pressure on Joshua to perform, and that could play out in Usyk's favor. But that being said, I wouldn't be shocked if Joshua got the win and he came out in a fashion in which he really tried to bully Usyk, depending on if that's truly in his nature or not. But we'll see.
Yeah, he needs, in my opinion, well, in a lot of people's opinion, he needs an aggressive game. But I was impressed by the alterations he made in his approach, responding to that loss to Ruiz, which for some people, like Wilder didn't take his first loss very well. Joshua just came in he was living a simple life. He did a little interview. He's living in this little stripped down apartment, keeping it very simple and focused. And he came in with a different game plan, pretty much stuck to it. He only got into that bad habit of clinching with Ruiz a couple times. He paid for it, but not fatally, and got it done. I think this time he needs to be the bully. He needs to lean on him a bit. He needs to push him around. He doesn't need to let him set his weight or get any kind of rhythm going. He just needs to be the bigger guy, and hopefully he's got the cardio to do that. Because the danger of that is that you then tire out, and then the more technical, faster fighter starts picking you off, and you don't have the stamina to take the shots, even if they're not as heavy. We are talking about big guys punching each other. You got to be able to take the shots. If you're tired, it's tough. So I think he can maybe do it. I know he's going to put his best effort at doing it. So Usyk's a great fighter, one of the best in the sport. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I do think Usyk's going to have to make adjustments himself to cope with the new approach. Because you saw like Ruiz didn't really make adjustments mid-fight that I saw to cope with the fact that Joshua was fighting a completely different fight.
Oh, yeah.
It was almost like he was still waiting for Joshua to make that mistake, but it's like, like overcommit to his hooks and things like that and leave himself susceptible. But he didn't really do that. And he only clinched a couple times and he got away with it, even though he did get clocked pretty good. So Usyk is a smart fighter. He's a very intelligent fighter. So I imagine he will make adjustments, but he's going to need to, in my opinion. I don't think either guy can do the same thing as last time. And if they do the same thing, Joshua will lose even worse than before. Because Usyk's now had a really good look at him, and got the best of it. So,
yeah, but, and I think that was a good example. I think that certainly, Joshua showed his prowess when he switched the way he fought against Ruiz the first time there in that second fight, was able to pretty much dominate him. In this case, I think he would need to make a switch back to the sort of aggressive Joshua that we saw in that first fight with Ruiz prior to getting stopped, because I don't see any scenario where he outboxes Usyk, who has more wrinkles from a fundamental standpoint to his game, just from an overall perspective. So I think that does make for a very intriguing matchup on paper here in this rematch. I think it is worth the hype that it is getting. And I look forward to seeing what the outcome is. If we get a trilogy out of it, I think the fans win.
Yeah, and it might be that if they do a trilogy, maybe you see a change up in approach again. Because we saw in the Fury Wilder trilogy 3 different fights.
Yeah.
The first fight was very cautious. I didn't think it was actually. I was excited while it was happening, but watching it back, it wasn't a very good fight to me. It had just brief moments. It wasn't. There was very little action. There was a lot of standing there looking at each other. The second fight, Fury switched it up and schooled him, and that was awesome. That was so cool to see. That was how big guys should fight, a guy with little skinny legs, And
Mhm.
but then the third fight was more competitive and a really good fight. So
Best of
yeah,
the three.
yeah, exactly. Trilogies can definitely work. The downside is nowadays the fights are so infrequent that a trilogy means other people are being shut out of their opportunity.
Yeah,
And
that
so
is true.
everyone's slowing down to accommodate the champion cycle. It didn't used to be like that. When Dempsey was hardly fighting, all the other heavyweights were doing crazy stuff. So
Yeah.
like I think in 1919, let me think. Well, I don't want to get into, I don't have my chart up and I can't look at anything right now. I'm on the road, but when Dempsey was hardly fighting, like when he fought Bill Brandon had been like, I think he'd gone like 19-1 in the several years leading up to that thing. When Jack Dempsey himself got his title shot, he had a ton of fights the year before. You know,
Oh yeah.
Langford, when he fought Barbados Walcott, had, you know, probably 35 fights in the, I don't know, in the 15 or 16 months leading up to the booking, and then the booking happened a couple months after that. You know, like nowadays a trilogy means 2 years, two
Yeah.
years maybe 3 years, depending on the guys. But for great fights, you know, we'll take what we can get, and I definitely think that's, for me, that's one of the most interesting. I don't think some of the other ones, at least in my mind, are as compelling stylistically, because Joshua's shown he can fight different fights. When he fought Povetkin, that stiff jab was
Hmm.
doing such great work. That is the wrong thing to do. Do not just try and like, oh yeah, I'm going to pop a jab at Usyk. That's not going to work for him. He's not fast enough to make that work in that setting. Even though with Povetkin that paid great dividends.
Yeah,
That
I
was a good
agree.
performance.
I
So
agree.
Joshua
Yeah.
can fight different ways. It's just, what's he going to do, and is he going to? If there's an opportunity in the fight to make a further adjustment, because Usyk will adjust himself. So then can Joshua now make that second adjustment during the fight? Can he do a Calzaghe and like switch it up? It's like if
Yeah.
Calzaghe fought like Ruiz in the Joshua rematch, you know, Calzaghe would have lost to Kessler because he was getting caught. He was leaving his head out there, getting hit with uppercuts. And then he made all the adjustments, and by the end of the fight, Kessler was so frustrated. Totally spoiled his styles. Hopkins, who you mentioned, was great at that, spoiling people's boxing.
Yeah.
So can Joshua make multiple adjustments? He'll definitely come in with a new game plan, but that's a fight I'm definitely looking forward to. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's great talking to you, but yeah, I've run out of time. I got to go in.
Hey, all good, all good. Definitely understand, my man. Yeah, appreciate it. We'll be able to do this again at some time shortly.
Yeah, Andre, Bruce, Rodolfo,
Shout out Bruce. Shout out
great to see you
Rodolfo.
guys. Yeah, and for anyone following afterwards, sorry this was all so short, but we just a timing thing. Let's do another one of these soon, Josh, and just talk, because this is an interesting subject. But I'd like to come in armed with some modern examples of guys who match super tough.
Okay, cool, cool. Yeah, that sounds like a plan for me.
Awesome, brother. Well, great to see everybody. Have a fantastic day, people.
Peace.
Peace.